Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to this VSI webinar series. This afternoon, we're going to be talking about Manchester City's hearing with CAS around their charges against financial fair play, which are going to be taking place at the beginning of next week. And in order to have that discussion and that debate, we've got a number of experts on the call with us today, namely Dr. Rob Wilson from Sheffield Hallam and Richard Millington from Shoesmiths. Proceedings are going to be led by Dr. Ian Lawrence, as usual, and we're going to jump into the debate and get engaged with the delegates on the platform. For full transparency, as you can see in the background, there is absolutely no bias on my behalf. I am a staunch Manchester City fan, so you can guess the direction of my thinking at this moment in time. But at this point, I'm going to hand over to Tim Coates, and Tim will explain how you guys on the platform can get engaged in the questions moving forward. Tim?
Cool, thanks very much, Tony. As always, if you are a panelist and you're an attendee on this webinar, you can ask questions by either using the Q&A button at the bottom or the chat button. Just type them in there and we'll come back to you, the time permitting. We'll get you to answer them live. If you're watching this live on YouTube, you cannot ask questions. The comments should be switched off, so it would be futile to do that. Just sit back and enjoy the show. And without further ado, the most amazing, talented authority in football as we know it, Mr. Ian Lawrence.
Thanks very much, Tim. Checks in the post. Let's start with the background to today's discussion. Man City's appeal against a 2-year ban from the Champions League and a potential fine of 30 million euros or roughly 25 million pounds sterling. The background to the allegations are interesting, to say the least, and go back to November 2018, when German newspaper Der Spiegel published leaked email documents alleging that City had broken financial fair play rules by overstating, that's a key word, overstating its sponsorship revenues in its accounts and in the break-even information submitted to UEFA between 2012 and 2016. The overstatement's interesting because it refers principally to concern regarding City's main sponsor, Abu Dhabi state airline Etihad, suggesting that City's owner, Sheikh Mansour, was funding the bulk of the 67.5 million Etihad sponsorship. So I'm going to start off with you, Rob, if you don't mind. There appears to be a lot of confusion regarding financial fair play. Given your expertise in football finance, why was financial fair play created in the first place? Why was it needed?
I think the answer to that question we can relatively simplify, I suppose. There were two main aims of financial fair play. One was to improve overall financial sustainability of clubs across European competition, and the other was to try and improve competitive balance in and around the UEFA competitions and indeed the principal leagues that constitute UEFA competition. So in that, we're talking about Premier League, La Liga, Serie A, Bundesliga, so on. And interestingly, the definition that UEFA use for competitive balance is different to an academic and a theoretical one. So what we're talking about essentially is teams being able to compete against each other on the playing field, and the excitement in competitions increasing as a consequence of that competition. So let's take Manchester City as the example here. When Manchester City takes the field against a team like Real Madrid or Barcelona, we don't really know what the result's going to be. That stimulates interest and ultimately allows UEFA as a governing body to generate more revenue through the sale of its broadcast and media rights. But let's go back to the first point, because I think that's going to flow through this webinar, which is around financial sustainability. And there was increasing concern right across Europe through the 2000s, predominantly about financial sustainability in UEFA club members. So we had situations, for example, at Real Madrid where they were heavily subsidized by the municipal government to the tune of around about 300 million euros, I think, all told. You had clubs that were heavily reliant on owner financing. So you'd look at someone like Chelsea, for example, highly dependent on the capital that their owners were prepared to invest. And the issue with that goes back to Leeds United. So heavy investment, stretching themselves way beyond their means, negotiating player contracts that they simply couldn't afford, and then suffering financial distress as a result of that. So financial fair play was designed to to eradicate all of those financial sustainability concerns, eradicate the idea that owners could invest privately in those football clubs to make sure that the football club itself could stand on its own 2 feet financially, wash its face financially, and continue trading for the long term, because there is this idea that football clubs are community assets almost, that they exist because of the fans that want to watch them play, and that if we allow private owners or investment companies to play around with the finances of those clubs, it could potentially destabilize them. So FFP was designed to prevent that, but also to improve the overall financial sustainability of its clubs. And I think we'll probably explore some of the pitfalls of doing that later.
Yeah, we will do. We'll certainly pick Richard's brain when we come to the legal ramifications of what's going on. And we'll talk about a case study with regards to Man City in terms of what we can expect, and try and lift the veil of secrecy regarding what CAS are doing at the moment. But while we're on financial fair play, does that mean in terms of financial stability or sustainability that clubs are no longer to have losses then in their accounts?
Theoretically, yes. So there are permissible losses. Those permissible losses will vary from league to league. So the Premier League has relatively substantial losses as part of its financial fair play protocols. UEFA ones are much stricter. They also limit the amount of owner investment that you're allowed to inject into the football club to sustain those losses. I think it's around about €5 million at the moment per season. So the whole idea is that you generate your income, you don't exceed the spending on that income, and you find this, what UEFA call the break-even requirement. That is to say, your income doesn't exceed your costs, or rather your costs don't exceed your income.
Okay. It appears that some clubs, and without naming names necessarily, have got enormous debts and don't appear to pay their debts. It just seems to be a scenario where this debt is just maintained and where they service the debts. Does that mean that those clubs can still comply with financial fair play if they have that scenario?
Yes, is the short answer to that question. So we always teach students borrowing is not necessarily a bad thing, providing you can pay your debts as they fall due. And what we need to look at in this context is, take Manchester United as an example, heavily debt financed to the tune of around about £450 million, I think, at the moment. But because of their income profile and the profits that they're able to generate, the servicing of that debt is well within their means, and therefore not a huge consideration for that particular club. And because it's leveraged against the financial market, whilst interest rates will fluctuate from time to time, as long as you're able to repay those debts and recover that interest as it falls due, then there's no real problem with that, either functionally from a financial point of view, but also practically in terms of financial fair play.
How are UEFA actually incentivizing clubs to become break-even compliant? What are, in terms of rules and regulations, how are they moving the financial health of the organisation forward?
That's where this starts to get quite interesting. So you remember that second point I talked about around this improving competitive balance across the competition? And that's designed to try and increase the volume of broadcast revenue, media rights revenue that UEFA can command from its crown jewel competition, UEFA Champions League, and through latterly the Europa League. And what we've seen in UEFA competitions is the prize money on offer through those competitions and the broadcast rights package value of those competitions has increased, which means that clubs participating in those competitions have seen significant increases in their revenues over the last at least the last 10 years specifically, as a consequence of playing in those competitions. So we can argue that through the advent of financial fair play and this sell to clubs to be more financially sustainable, the rewards have been more prize money through their own competition.
It is the heart of financial fair play, this notion of competitive balance, in that we want to try and have as many teams as possible in the league having as much chance of winning as possible, and that we don't just have domination by one or two teams. Yeah,
it's also the paradox, isn't it, with the regulation? So it's something we've written about relatively extensively at the university, is that while you have this kind of twin approach to financial fair play, you cannot simply achieve both. So the more teams are able to participate in European competition, the more money they will generate as a consequence of playing in those competitions, the further away they will naturally become in income terms in their own home leagues. And what we also know is there's a direct correlation between your income profile, the profits that you make, and your finishing position in the league, i.e., the bigger you are in financial terms, the more successful you are on the field. So that in many ways distorts competitive balance, which is why we hear much more frequently now conversations around potential European Super Leagues, because you're trying to take all those big teams in the European leagues to put them together for competitive balance purposes. What, of course, we love in the Premier League is that whilst we look at our research, competitive balance is declining, it's still more competitive as a top level league than any other league in Europe. So, you know, the Bundesliga, whilst it's come back in this coronavirus pandemic, you know, we know that Bayern Munich are going to win that competition, and that's why their broadcast revenues are smaller.
Richard, it'd be good to get your thoughts on this in terms of competitive balance. Is financial fair play needed from a legal perspective? Should it just be something as simple as survival of the fittest?
I think it's a really interesting question. And if you go back to the origins of financial fair play, there were questions at the time around how EU law would work with it. In effect, under EU law, and there's a similar provision in most other states, is the idea that you cannot join up with your competitors, let's say, and instigate rules that might reduce competition in a marketplace. And that was certainly, there was a lot of talk around that when financial fair play came in. If you look at it in the way that a group of clubs have gotten together and decided that actually you can't spend a certain amount that clubs have done historically to get into that elite level, you have to do it in a different way, let's say. And the penalty for that is that you can't compete. So effectively it forms a barrier to entry to that market. And there was some early talk around, well, there was a challenge, but it was let's best describe probably as half-hearted, in terms of it was referred to Brussels in around 2005 by, there was a case, that came out of Belgium that was referred to Brussels. And it didn't really conclusively talk about that point. And there was also talk around when this issue first came up with City and I think also with PSG, because here you're talking, you know, certainly PSG and both cases very well-funded organisations with very big teams and very smart lawyers, that could have been seen as something that encouraged a settlement at the time from UEFA in both cases, that actually to agree settlements with both clubs versus having them challenge FFP in full was a price worth paying. So it is still, I guess, a question that's out there because no one has yet challenged it.
Question with your legal hat on, is FFP in line with European law, and is that going to change potentially in terms of conversations between UEFA and European Commission post-Brexit?
Well, at the moment, I mean, everything in terms of the impact of EU law on the UK, I guess, is up for negotiation because we are leaving the EU at the end of this year. Our general understanding is that there will be some form of reciprocity between EU and UK competition law. So in effect, there'll be no change in terms of how it's applied. You know, is FFP in line with European law? As I said, it's really still, I think, open for debate, and you'll see academic pieces arguing both ways. Fundamentally, look, I mean, number one, UEFA wouldn't have done something like this without having conducted a pretty deep dive in terms of its position again and how it would stand against FFP. So anyone who does think about challenging this, you know, they'll be up against a well-prepared and drilled argument, and not just a legal argument, but a political one as well, in terms of if you look at the sort of communication that's come out of the EU down the years in terms of how they view sport and this concept that sport is a force for good and therefore maybe gets a little bit more of a leeway. And they are maybe more open to arguments that if a sporting body comes through and says this is really needed for the health of the sport, and the concept being that if the top of the sport is good, it helps trickle down to the grassroots level as well. That if you want to challenge that, and if Brussels did want to challenge it, it would be a huge statement from Brussels. Not that, I mean, obviously it's happened before with the Bosman case that fundamentally changed how the football transfer system was run and effectively players were valued. But I do think it's an area that is still, look, it's still debated today. I think this case just brings the debate back out to the public again. There are arguments to say, okay, if you want to maintain a competitive structure within Europe, is this the best way of doing it? And you'll see people talk openly around, well, actually, is a wage cap structure a better form of achieving the same aim? Could you look at a system whereby a new market entry, let's say if the owners at PSG were to come in today and they wanted to move their club from here to here, could you have an allowance for 3 or 4 years when it doesn't apply? When, say, in any other industry, if you want to come in and you want to grow quickly, then it's pretty common to overinvest at the start well ahead of the return. So could you look at a system like that, which obviously wouldn't necessarily cause any financial instability, but it would allow and encourage investment into football, which actually at the minute is a very big question because of the challenges that COVID have brought into the football industry.
Before we get into the allegations levelled at Man City, and we'll talk in depth about that in a second, question for you, Rob, about Man City as an organisation. For those of us who are not implicitly insightful about how Man City manage their books, how do they money? They've got a global network, they've got an ownership portfolio, they've got clubs in every continent. Are they a well-managed club financially, Rob?
Short answer to that one, Ian, is yes, they are. Very, very well managed. The income profile of the club has grown extensively over the last 8 to 10 years. In particular, the commercial revenue growth has been nothing short of emphatic. They completely now stand up against the European elite. And when we talk about European elite, we're talking the likes of Manchester United, of Liverpool, Real Madrid, Barcelona, Bayern Munich, Juventus. They are absolutely on that same level now. And indeed, if you looked at their finances, you would see a very well-run organisation. As you say, they're a global network through the City Football Group. Very cautious investment portfolio, actually, when you consider the types of players they acquire. Whilst they spend big money on players, and they're noted for their high transfer fees they pay, I don't think they've had a player that's in the top 10 transfers list, certainly over the last few years. So whilst they're spending money, they're doing it in a prudent way, and they're building a very, very good business model, investing heavily at grassroots and through their academy structure. So, the short answer is yes. The longer answer is yes again. My question with Manchester City, which is where we'll get to, I think, on this, is where is that income profile derived from? On what is it based? And where does it actually generate its money? Because we will start to investigate those sponsorship and commercial endorsements that they've been able to grow, and the history and the positioning of where they've come from.
Richard, let's try and lift the veil of secrecy surrounding the Court of Arbitration sport. And first question, is this kind of regulatory process a good thing? It's not a public hearing. Can you just give us some insight there?
Yeah, I'd say it's not a public hearing, but if the parties agree, then the decision is published. And if you go on the CAS website, you'll see there's now quite a volume of actually published decisions, so you can track how CAS have thought about this in the past. Now, like any arbitral body, it's not necessarily bound by precedent, but it still gives you an idea of how they're thinking about this. And you can also, even particularly on financial fair play issues, you can also look on the UEFA's website and see previous settlement agreements they've reached and previous decisions they've reached. So it gives you a context there. I mean, CAS is ultimately an arbitral body, and one of the benefits of arbitration is confidentiality. So there won't necessarily be, in the same way you would see with a case that's conducted in the courts, the ability to go and see pleadings and interim court decisions. But I would say CAS right now, in terms of its transparency, is making good moves, I think. So you can go in there now and see those decisions. I think in terms of how it operates, it's relatively clear cut. I mean, it's got quite a long history now. It started in 1984. It's widely used in sport. It's particularly good in areas like this, which are down to interpretation of sporting rules and regulations, i.e. those that are implemented by national or international sporting bodies. So yeah, I think it's a good forum for these kinds of things. They'll have gone through a process where each side nominate an arbitrator, and then CAS appoint an arbitrator, and then written submissions are put in, and then obviously there's a hearing that they will go through. I think interestingly in this case, because City went for an early strikeout, and plus also filed a complaint around what they perceive to be UEFA's behaviour and the perception that there have been some leaks. We have already got a line in terms of the early positioning of the parties, which you wouldn't normally have. Yeah, it's a well-regarded and respected body ultimately.
Rob, is it a little bit of creative accountancy on the behalf of Man City in terms of their sponsorship deal?
That's what it would suggest. If we go back on this, there have always been a number of questions about how Manchester City have derived some of their sponsorship revenue. So we go back to let's go right the way back to the stadium naming rights with Etihad that I think was fairly contentious right from the outset of FFP. And a lot was made of the market value on that particular sponsorship deal. So as somebody that analyses this stuff, you would always benchmark that against a competitor. So Man City sold their sponsorship naming rights for around about 40 million. I think it included the shirt sponsorship at the time as well, per year. At the same time, Arsenal, who would remember at that time being in the latter stage of the Champions League for I think 9 out of the previous 10 years, had won the domestic double at least on 1 or 2 occasions in that same 10-year period, had sold their same stadium naming rights deal with shirt sponsorship for 20 million a year. So when you compared the two clubs, there was something that stood out as perhaps not quite right. Now, I think, and I'm really picking back in my memory now, when that particular case started to come out into the press, it was kind of agreed, I think, between the lawyers that it was just about at market value. How do we determine market value? Surely it's worth something that someone's prepared to pay. Man City were going through this revolution at the time, so their future value probably typified this 40 million deal. What we then got was a series of commercial endorsements that were made by companies that there was a tenuous association with the Abu Dhabi royal family, and through groups that weren't directly involved in the running of Manchester City. So the more recent Etihad deal, which is what this case I believe is really focused on, is where the money has come from to support the sponsorship deal that they are currently using. And without quoting the figures directly, what was unearthed by the Der Spiegel investigations were that only a very small proportion of the Etihad sponsorship deal was paid directly from Etihad to Manchester City as part of that deal. And some of the money, a large proportion of that money, in fact, had come from a third-party company paid to Etihad, or should have been paid to Etihad, and then paid to Manchester City. I think what's happened in very layman's terms is if you've got 3 organisations, so Man City is organisation A, they should have a transaction with organisation B where the sponsorship deal happens. What's happened in this instance is that another organisation C has actually paid Man City. So it looks like the sponsorship value they've generated has come from another organisation rather than the one that was originally set out to be the sponsor. And actually that sponsor itself is heavily linked to the Abu Dhabi royal family and therefore the ownership of the football club. So go right the way back to the start of this conversation, omitting significant owner investment in the football club under FFP seems to have been circumvented in some way through sponsorship and commercial endorsements through that same organisation.
Richard, Man City self-evidently are contesting the charges, and the case is going to be heard next week in Switzerland over a couple of days. They vehemently deny any wrongdoing and accusations that are flying around that they failed to cooperate with UEFA's investigation. According to and I think the chairman's widely quoted on record as saying this, facts will prevail. We will respect the regulatory bodies and their process. If the process is judged on facts, we will prevail. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's always, or it can be easy at times like this to try and judge it on press coverage, right? And let's be clear, no one knows the full facts right now. There were emails leaked to the press. No one knows the source of those emails. As anyone knows, with an email, to leak the contents of a single email or 3 or 4 emails can give one picture. I think to see the whole context of the communication and how it's actioned, how it's implemented can lead to a wholly different picture. And I think that'll be what he'll be thinking about there. And in particular, you'll see from, as I said, the early indication when CAS published an earlier decision on this in 2019, so this interim application in effect, is that from that you could tell that City felt that the investigation hadn't been concluded. In effect, they said, well, hang on a second, we were still engaging in this investigation procedure. We weren't getting responses to certain things. So in effect, this is a premature judgment or referral rather. And I think that's one interesting aspect of it. I think the second one is that there's then procedural issues around what UEFA are trying to do here. And what was quite interesting was the reference to the previous settlement agreement. So I think they'll get into arguments over whether or not actually fundamentally these issues were either settled previously or actually relate to periods which UEFA can't simply time bar from going back into now. And I think, look, those are all procedural ones. I don't think you should look at those as being, oh, they're trying to get away with it. It's simply a procedural argument, which is a fair one to raise. And fundamentally what they're saying is UEFA never actually, the investigatory chamber never actually concluded their investigation and gave City a fair hearing. And interesting, although that we're talking about the hearing in CAS, when you talk about procedural issues and fairness issues, those are issues which, if City are unhappy with the CAS outcome, they can go to the Swiss court to have jurisdiction over CAS around those kinds of points. So I think with anything like this, these are complex organisations. I think, yes, you can look at a sponsorship number and think, crikey, that seems big. But actually, having been in and around sponsorship and rights deals for like 20 years, deals sometimes just happen. You think, crikey, we've got a great deal here. Who knew that? You've seen in the press recently, I think Umbro sold its China business for quite a big number that was reported. You might look at that deal and go, crikey, how's that happened? So these things do happen. And I think if you look at City at the time, it's quite an exciting project to be part of. There's a lot of national pride there for Abu Dhabi. So actually, I would swing the other way and say you can totally see why you wanted to be part of that story, because there's real power from a marketing point of view being part of the story. And again, I wouldn't read too much into the emails either personally until you know the full story of these situations. And you've got to think as well, why were these emails leaked? Who leaked them? What was the angle? Because there's always politics at play here, and Der Spiegel has a track record also in terms of attacking City and the settlements, and then you can be very nationalistic about it and say, well, hang on a second, Bayern Munich's one of the kind of big institutions of European football. And so are there angles that so people don't like the new guys coming in. So there's all sorts of politics as well at play with the legal aspects here. So yeah, really, really interesting.
Rob, interesting to get your thoughts on this. City have been accused of systematic and a deliberate breach of the rules. So in effect, they've tried to cheat. That's the allegation. Mm-hmm. Is it within the rules potentially, but outside of the spirit of what financial fair play is about?
I think, yeah, I'd go along with that. Absolutely everything Richard said there is dead right. You look at Man City through 2010 through to about 2015. It's probably the most exciting football project on the planet. It probably still is now, if you consider the breadth of the City Football Group and the way they've really torn up the rule book about how a professional team sport should be structured, governed, regulated, and so on, and the web that they have created that other clubs now are looking at, and if you compare them to competitors across the city at Manchester United, and Manchester United were doing similar things through the 2000s with their big sponsorship deals. So Adidas, for example, spending 75 million a year on a license fee to produce their match shirts was unprecedented at that time, and a lot of people looked at that and thought, is that too much? Adidas were clearly fairly set on the fact that they were going to pin their hopes to football. They then backed out of organisations like, I think, the British and Irish Lions, England, Wales Cricket Board, Andy Murray as well, for example, because they couldn't afford to keep spending all this money. So the sponsorship deal itself is interesting. What I've been fascinated with the response from Manchester City is they are pushing the legal side of this, the loophole or the loopholes, the points of law that Rich just mentioned, what they might contest, the fact that these are leaked emails, and then you have that kind of geopolitical thing overlaid all of that. In fact, some of this stuff came out in the New York Times, I think, which were linked to the ownership of Liverpool, Der Spiegel, and Bayern Munich, and so on. But go back to your question, the spirit of competition is what as fans we want to see. We want to see fairness in competition. We want to see closeness in competition. And we've started to coin this phrase publicly now around financial doping, which we would normally consider to be, drugs cheats in athletics, for example. And, the uproar that we saw in one of the first Olympics I remember watching in, I think it was 92, when Ben Johnson ran that amazing time in 100 meters. And of course, did it through stimulating himself through performance enhancing drugs, and then was taken down. So he systematically and deliberately cheated the rules to gain a competitive advantage. And I think that's where this case study becomes so interesting, is have Manchester City sought to gain competitive advantage unfairly through financial doping compared to the rest of their European counterparts? Or actually, are they trying to break the system and the norm that a club would go through? So, Real Madrid, or Barcelona, or Bayern Munich have got tens of years of elite level competition that supports their business model and makes them the mammoth organizations they are. And with the greatest respect, Manchester City haven't come from that same history. In the same period that we're talking about, I think they were playing in League Two. So they've had this existential rise that points immediately to, well, they must have done something against the rules there. And I think really challenge the fabric of what we're trying to achieve through regulation in professional team sport is are we trying to make sure that nobody else can join these this European elite, so to speak, and protect a status quo? Or should we allow new entrants to the market in a particular way? But then I go back to the fact that Man City ultimately helped support the development of financial fair play, ultimately agreed to abide by its rules. So, my philosophical standpoint on it is, if they've broken those rules that they've at some point signed up to, whether they agree with them or not, whether they think they're legal or not, if they've broken them, they get punished accordingly.
Richard, it'd be interesting for you to outline the punishments that are on the table for Man City, assuming that the allegations that they're proven. Are the punishments that are being proposed proportionate to the alleged crime? What's your take on that?
So if you go with the allegation being, number one, breach of financial fair play regulations, right, which are embedded in UEFA's licensing system, and then you go with the second one, which is arguably more serious, which is that they effectively concealed information from UEFA, and that's really why I guess this has generated so much press. The fact that although there'd been a settlement, that they're claiming that these were withheld, this information was withheld. And so you look at UEFA's track record. Suspensions have previously been imposed. Say, for example, with AC Milan, I think that was reduced down to a year on appeal. And the typical, if you go through the decisions, and there's decisions that are actually issued fairly frequently, because financial fair play is not just about this revenue, it's actually also about, have you paid your debt? So do you owe anything to other football clubs? There's a whole load of requirements in there, not just this break-even test. And typically what you find is the penalties will range from fines for a few £100,000, it could be for a delay in submitting numbers, or a failure to have made a certain debt payment, all the way up to suspensions for the more serious offences. And those suspensions apply across the board. So it's not just the big teams that have been hit by them, it's also some of the smaller teams where you think maybe they're not losing so much by being suspended for a couple of years. So there's a wide range. And I think this one is a little unprecedented because of that allegation, in effect, that there wasn't full disclosure. And so you would see, if you look at track record, and again, they're not necessarily bound by precedent, but they are, the concept of fairness is very much instilled in how these things have to be operated. That if those allegations are proven true, then that level of fine and suspension would appear to be in line. It depends to what extent they're proven true, though, because again, one of the key things City are contesting is that they didn't conclude the investigation fairly or properly, i.e. City was still trying to communicate with the investigatory chamber and weren't receiving responses at times, which is a pretty serious allegation in fairness against that chamber. And so I think it'll be interesting, and I suspect whatever comes out of it, which could be anything from an annulment of the decision through to obviously the full upholding of that decision. It will be interesting to see, number one, what's the actual finding, and then two, how that impacts on what actually comes out. Because I think, and again, this is just going on press story, that there seems to be fundamentally a 1-year suspension for the club will not have such a big impact. I'm a Man United fan, so I feel like we've had a 2-year suspension for the Champions League, and we've survived it, you know. And I think a 2-year suspension will be pretty seismic, potentially. You never know, but just because of the impact on players who are getting to a certain age will maybe look at it and think, well, hang on, do I stay here now? Or do I want to move? So I think the 2-year ban will be pretty seismic in terms of its impact here. So it'll be interesting to see.
Rob, let's explore that worst case financial scenario for Man City, and if their appeal fails. How important is the Champions League in general terms for a club's revenue and for how they operate?
Yeah, very is the easy answer on that one. What you find, particularly in the Premier League, is that, you know, 1 or 2 clubs will often make the latter stages of that competition. So you're talking upwards of 70, anywhere to 100 million euros per year for those clubs competing in that competition. So that is essentially 20% of Man City's revenue, or Manchester United's revenue, or probably a little bit more of Liverpool's or Arsenal's, Chelsea's, and so on. It's also significantly more than a number of their other rivals in the Premier League. So take Tottenham as the example in that context. A 2-year ban to Man City would be very expensive in revenue terms. As Rich points out, I think they would also struggle with some of their player contract negotiations. You would naturally, as we saw at Manchester United, when you don't have Champions League football, you tend to have to pay more money on transfer fees and on those player wages, and you end up in a pretty vicious circle in that regard that you need to then be able to stimulate. And of course, everybody else that's playing in the UEFA competitions is earning that money that you're then not exposed to. So the gap between those that are playing in the competition and those that aren't increases every year that you're out of the competition, which is why I think we'll see, you know, likes of Arsenal and Chelsea struggling. Certainly in the short term with those competitions, and we're seeing Manchester United be quite aggressive in their pursuit of trying to get back in. So a 2-year ban, I think, would be quite profound, particularly for a club like Manchester City. That said, what you might then see them do is try and sign, you know, additional commercial deals, sponsorship deals, in the same way that PSG did actually a couple of years ago when they signed Neymar to make sure that they could afford his amortized player contract over the useful life of that particular contract. So I think it will be a challenging couple of years for them. My gut feeling is that they'll, you know, CAS will agree with a number of points of argument that they're making. I think the ban will probably be reduced and they'll end up with the fine. So I think we'll be talking about a year ban as a worst case scenario for them, based on the research that I've done anyway.
Richard, question for you, and Rob, if you wouldn't mind joining in when Richard's finished on this one. It feels, certainly if you're a Man City, that this appears very clearly as an attack on Man City, but more broadly as an attack on the Premier League. And a lot of the accusations and a lot of the momentum for the allegations seem to be coming from La Liga in Spain. If you were legal counsel for either Man City or for the Premier League, would you, hairs on the back of your neck, start to stand up now in terms of we need to defend our brand a little bit more rigorously?
I think that the defence that, you know, from a legal point of view, the defence of City has mounted, from what I can tell, in terms of reading through the CAS decisions and looking at the press, has been robust and has been significant. I think interesting with Spain only in that there's always been a suspicion that we're talking about FFP as a potential something that might not be compliant with the EU competition law. One of the other key principles of EU competition law is the one that prohibits state aid or unlawful state aid, and that's always been an allegation that's been thrown at the top Spanish clubs, in effect, Real Madrid and Barcelona, in terms of their receiving of either funds or funds in a very beneficial manner. I'm not aware of anyone really pushing that further, but certainly, having been in the industry, that's always been something that's been kicked around as an allegation. And actually, taking a step outside of football, that's fairly common in a lot of industries, actually, where the perception is that the Brits and the UK will adhere to things like state aid laws pretty rigorously, and then there will be a strong suspicion that maybe the French, the Italian, and the Spanish don't, in really simple terms. So again, we're expecting an equivalent to state aid to still exist in the UK post Brexit, but it's I think, particularly with the British sensibility, I think to stand up and trying to accuse someone else of doing something worse than what you've been accused of is a tough line to run as a defence. I think you're always best just focusing on what you've done and what you're accused of, and sticking to a very strict line of defence on that. And I think the key thing for City has been in the press has been always to make it clear that they feel like they've done the right thing. I think it's a pretty serious allegation that UEFA effectively put in there, that you haven't done the right thing and you've somehow hid stuff. I think that's probably the most serious aspect of what City have been accused of.
Rob, your thoughts? Have City distorted the market and there's a little bit of jealousy from overseas?
Yeah, I think the market's distorted anyway. Just to pick up on a couple of Rich's points, state aid being, I think, fairly historically rife, certainly in Spain. And municipal aid that went into Real Madrid was extensive through the 90s and into the 2000s. And they were absolutely not a bona fide business, were underpinned by that municipal government. You look, there's a huge amount of jealousy across Europe for the sorts of fees that the English Premier League generates in terms of its media broadcast rights. Richard Scudamore, as chief exec of that organisation, absolutely trailblazed the Premier League. It turned it into a global brand, and everybody else just kind of stood back and thought, "Wow, how on earth have you managed that?" So we've always heard stories of a lack of fairness with Premier League clubs, that they generate too much income, that it's not fair on the rest of European competition, and so on and so forth. But let's just think about those European counterparts, for example. Real Madrid and Barcelona, until last year, were able to generate all of their TV rights for La Liga, which meant that those two clubs were soaking up around about 75% of the total TV revenue that was on offer to Spanish clubs. So in exactly the same way as we're challenging stuff around Man City and the English Premier League here, we should really be challenging La Liga on the way that their organisation is structured, and the fact that a small team like Granada, for example, is never going to get an equal share of their TV deal because Barcelona and Real have soaked up all of that money. And look at someone like Bayern Munich and the association with corporate sponsorships there that link back to the government. You look to Juventus and the associations they've got with Fiat, and so on and so forth. There are so many measures of imbalance across the European system that I think it's actually quite easy to poke the finger at a team like Manchester City. Let's not forget that French teams, and particularly Michel Platini, was up in arms in 2007, 8, 9 about the fact there were no French teams being able to compete in the elite competition. So all of a sudden, financial fair play comes along at the same time that PSG was taken over by the Qatari government. So there is a distinct irony in that situation for me. The reality is what UEFA and FIFA need to try and do is generate as level a playing field as they possibly can from a competition integrity point of view. To go back to your initial point, which is about the spirit of the competition, and then my points around competitive balance. If you are able to protect competitive balance, you end up with a more competitive product, which generates more money for everybody. And that leads me to wonder whether or not what Manchester City have done here actually is in the spirit of competition. By investing the billion or so that Mansour has been able to put into the club, has shaken the tree somewhat in Europe, has put somebody else at the top table, has generated a different brand of football, has has attracted new players to the English Premier League, has broken the status quo in the Premier League, which has allowed the Premier League to generate even more TV revenue. So sometimes you need these unique examples. You go to rugby union, Saracens were allowed to break the salary cap for years without consequence, not because the teams were upset by it, but because they were achieving so many things in European competition, which allowed the standard of the English Premiership to improve in that sport. So sometimes we need something different. Sometimes we need a real challenge, and I think that's what Man City have perhaps done here. You know, whether we like it or not. I do think if they've, go back to my point, if they systematically sought to gain advantage through breaking rules, and I think they need to be punished. But you know, let's not forget that there are some positives to come from how they've operated since the takeover in 2008-9.
That's really interesting, Rob. Richard, what are your thoughts on what Rob's alluding to there in terms of the unintended positive consequences of what's happened? Does the legal animal necessarily move with the kind of dynamism that it needs to move in terms of these statutory regulatory bodies in order to evolve and look at the positives of what City's case study have achieved?
I think it's a really interesting point, because if you think fundamentally, FFP was on the face of it about financial stability in football. Wasn't so much about the fairness of competition. It was more about that financial stability. They always say, well, hey, look, debt's down, number of clubs going into any form of insolvency procedure is down, therefore financial fair play is achieving its aim. So you would go, okay, I get that. And then on the other hand, you go, how does that work with then attacking an investor who has come in, invested significant sums into the Northwest economy, significant funds into football, and not just obviously in the UK, because City Football Group is a group of around 9, I think, or 10 football clubs now, investing significantly in youth, in education, in various initiatives that benefit certainly the local economies wherever they operate. And you look at, and clearly is sustainable. There's no question of any solvency issue here. This is not about that. So fundamentally, what UEFA, I guess, would say was, well, actually, because City have done that, they would then encourage others who aren't able to do that to somehow overspend. You know, I think that might be the argument, but it is a tough one, because you look at it and think there have been, you know, significant benefits brought, much broader context, let's say. Now, I think UEFA would argue that actually the long-term damage by allowing overspending, which then encourages others to overspend without those FFP rules, is the inherent issue there. It gets into all sorts of things then around how football clubs are operated. You know, there's a lot of talk right now about how FFP might be relaxed because of the COVID impact on football finances. But then we know from working with other clubs who have very robust finances, they're saying, well, hang on a second, we've run a tight ship for a number of years. Why should those guys who've been spending loads of money now get away with it, right? So it's a really, really tough issue to wrestle with. And I say, you know, FFP is very detailed in terms of the regulations. There's obviously a lot of thought gone into them in terms of the impact, what they're trying to achieve, and then clearly a huge amount of thought in terms of how you actually negotiate breaches of that. How to think about clubs. And yes, you know, I think Marseille is the latest one to be had up, but yes, the headline ones will always come through, but FFP issues fall all the way through all the way through the football pyramid now. You know, most leagues have a version of them. Yes, the EPL and obviously also the Football League have versions of them. So, and they all broadly follow a similar tenet. So I think it is very, very complicated and has huge socio-economic impacts, whichever way you look at it, frankly.
Final question from me before we go to Tim for questions from the audience. I'd like both of you to answer this one, please. Rob, start with you. So financial fair play is evolving. It's a set of rules and regulations which naturally will evolve. Are there any lessons that the people in UEFA can maybe take as examples or best practice from other sports overseas? Richard mentioned before about a wage cap. Would this ultimately help UEFA moving forward?
I think if you look at any sport, there will be case examples of organisations that are run effectively and very, very well. I think if you ask me for for probably the best run sport, I'd probably give you the NFL as the example, because of the way the revenue's distributed, because of the salary cap and the draft system that they tend to use. One of the really fascinating components of FFP that I always find is what Rich mentioned there. So solvency across European football clubs is much better. Profits in most football clubs are much better. We're not seeing the instances of financial collapse that we used to. The natural assumption that UEFA are jumping to is that that's as a consequence of their regulations. But I think we should challenge that, actually, is certainly as an academic, that actually what has driven football clubs' finances over the last 10 years is nothing to do with FFP. It's to do with the fact that broadcast rights have increased exponentially because of new clubs coming into the status quo, because of the way they're spending. I'd also suggest that there are many more different types of ownership model in professional football, particular increase in the number of US-based owners, which, if you go back to the point I've just made about the NFL, it naturally follows that a US level owner will tend to be much more profit maximized as an owner, will look at revenue generation, commercial endorsements and so on, so raise the income profile. So there are so many other things that have gone on in the marketplace that have supported the development of football finances. I think what the regulations have done is perhaps given a safety net to all those clubs to make sure that they operate within a certain set of regulations, which has allowed them to be perhaps more sustainable. And I don't think that's a bad thing. We've just got to be very careful about how we implement some of those regulations to make sure that actually we don't get, in competitive balance terms at least, too much single market concentration. So nobody really wants to see a competition that has one single team dominating all the time. Look at the Bundesliga as an example. As I started at the outset of this webinar, Bayern Munich will canter to the league. I love watching football. I haven't tuned into any of the Bundesliga on BT Sport because you pretty much know what the results are going to be every game. So they might as well play in empty stadiums for my money.
I think
Rich, final thoughts with you, Rich?
Yeah, I was going to say the financial doping as well that you mentioned there is quite interesting. I think there was a comment from Rick Parry not long ago where he talked about one of the biggest issues with the English Football League was the parachute payments.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, actually, if you talk about, and they have a couple of issues. One, teams that go down have this huge resource for a year or so that other teams don't fundamentally. So naturally gives them an advantage. But also because of the finances that are available in the Premier League and the fact that you can then budget in, okay, if I get promoted and then I'm relegated the next year, I still get this parachute payment, that then influences the finances of the whole league. So it encourages the overspending. It's that actually that probably encourages the overspending more than anything else in that league, is that carrot that gets dangled. And then you have all sorts of financial challenges that come with that, unfortunately. So I think if you zone in too much on financial doping and wishing to stop it, it's such a broad issue that it's really hard to pick off aspects of it. And I think Rob just made a great point as well in terms of the solvency and the overall professionalisation. And you've seen that really in the Premier League as well, where years ago when I was working for Nike based out of Old Trafford, there was certainly talk that at that time Manchester United was head and shoulders just in terms of being a professional organisation above pretty much every other Premier League club. Well, if you look at all the Premier League clubs now, it's probably the top half really now of the Premier League who you could say are actually now professionally set up, being well run, got good guys in, professional guys, and that could also be just reinforcing what Robert said in terms of how football has evolved to be a more professional business. Certainly the top end. I think that further down, there's still big questions, but certainly the top end, I think it has.
That's probably a good place to stop. Thanks, Rich. Thanks, Rob. I'm going to pass over to Tim now. I'm sure he's got a bunch of questions from the audience.
I've indeed. Thanks, Ian. Really insightful. I'm going to ask, Dean's actually put one on here, and I think it's quite an explanation. I'm going to unmute him so he can ask it himself. Dean, I've unmuted you. Do you want to pick up and ask you a question?
Hi, guys. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Got you.
Right, okay. Yeah, really, it was just we talk about the top level teams and who wants to spend and how they want to spend it on. Is it kind of a moot point anyway? Is it just an elitist view and conversation when the important issue is fundamentally securing clubs and the knock-on effect of the lower league teams and all the way down to grassroots level? someone's always going to win the Champions League, the Premier League, whatever else. But if you're looking at a total safety and security and integrity, really, of football, is it really just ensuring that everyone is safe, secure in those communities and what the clubs provide to local areas? Is that the important thing that we should be focusing on here?
Who do you want to direct that question to, Dean?
Whoever wants to answer, I suppose.
I'll start off if you want, because I think what you touched on there is one of the aspects that UEFA and sport in general has relied on in defending, in effect, its attempts to self-regulate, i.e., because we produce this inherent good for people, because sport is a good thing, and we need competitive sport at the top level to encourage all of that, then you, the EU, which is local to us, should therefore look at the way in which we operate through a slightly softer lens than, say, I don't know, use the classic guys who always get full foul of competition law, will be the concrete industry, right? You should look at the concrete industry very differently to the football industry. And I think to that point, what you're talking about there is really interesting, because I think if football, which we're talking about today, moves away from that concept of the funds fundamentally in some way, shape or form tearing down, or dripping down through and benefiting the grassroots, I think that argument and potentially the way in which it's viewed can change over time.
What about in terms of not just filtering the money down, but if like when we saw Chelsea, I think, and I'm not sure you'd probably be able to tell me how accurate this is, but when Chelsea come in and then started to pay a lot more players, a lot more money to attract them, that knock-on effect then that every other Premier League team needed to increase their wages for all of their players, and then also with the amount of games and the quality that's expected out of all of the teams now, that actually you've got more players on a higher salary than what the clubs can really manage. So the knock-on effect, not just being the distribution of funds, but it's also what it creates in terms of an expenditure for clubs.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, one way it does trickle down, even in a situation like Chelsea, though, is that you then have the benefit because transfer values go up, that clubs lower down the league can get more money for their players. So there are clubs outside the Premier League whose business model is predicated on finding talent and selling it into the Premier League, and that's what actually funds their clubs, a bit like Lyon. So I'd say it's not just as simple as spending money and forcing others to spend money is necessarily a bad thing. And if you look now at the profitability in the Premier League, you'd say, well, actually, that investment by Chelsea and that maybe then forced others to invest at that time could actually now be seen as having been, a good thing, right? And even before Chelsea, you had Jack Walker at Blackburn, who I guess was the first guy I was personally aware of who, as a Man United fan, I would say interfered with football.
It does, Dean. There's an important point there. There has been an increase in wage inflation as a consequence of one or two clubs drawing a line in the sand, and go back to Manchester United and what they paid for Alexis Sanchez, and the even if he's on 50% of what we read about in the press, distorted what players would get paid and kind of rebalance that. What I always do when I get asked questions like that is come back to first principles of business, which is if you're in charge of an organisation, you have a choice whether or not to sign that player and to pay the wages that are on offer. And what I actually see in professional football, at least from the outside looking in, is a real inability to say no and to walk away. And we've seen a bit more of that recently. We saw it at Huddersfield Town in particular when they joined the league, where they would walk away from deals that were just too expensive for them. And I think we need to see clubs respond much more like that and be stronger in the negotiations that they're having. And that's easy for me to say sitting here, much more difficult in practice. And I think is also why we'll hear a lot more over the next few years around things like wage controls, wage caps, salary caps, squad size limits, and all that type of thing. Because further down the system, we need to have some levels of protection to make sure that I think Rich mentioned it earlier on. There's much more inequality in those leagues and much more float from what's sound financially and what's not, and they probably need a stronger level of regulation to protect them to a certain extent.
Okay, well, I think that kind of hits on the next question that Paul's actually put on, Paul Hilton. I'm going to unmute you anyway, Paul, so you can ask your question. Just think about who you want to direct it to. Paul, are you there?
Yeah, either again, it's a question for all really, but I mean, obviously, it's important that we maintain and protect the clubs and the competitions from rogue owners and poor ownership, and that essentially was what we were all led to believe that FFP was brought in to do. It seems to have got changed over time in terms of what it actually does, and for me, investment is always been a very, very important part of sport and the game as a whole. And in that essence, would it not make more sense that, for new players to the game, so to speak, would be asked to put a bond down, essentially, they'd be held centrally that could cover any potential liabilities, and that'll allow investment into the sport, which obviously has its benefits. And then even potentially going on from that, any bond that was put in centrally, the interest from that bond could then be reinvested in the grassroots game.
So there's fair shout there. The first part of what you said, Paul, around this is the financial fair play in some instances was intended to protect clubs from those rogue owners. I think is still fair and is still in place now. That is ultimately what this is about, isn't it? This is, even if we talk about the context of Man City, is if the Mansour royal family walk away from the football club next year, leave all their investment in, don't want any money back, are Man City still a sustainable business, yes or no? And I think what we've seen at City is that yes, they would be. If we go back to say 2006-07, when Abramovich was doing it at Chelsea, if he'd have walked away and said, you keep everything I've invested, they'd have pretty much gone insolvent within the space of a week, because they couldn't afford the player wages that they'd signed up to without his investment. So there's absolutely a level of consideration there around ownership. I've also talked quite extensively in the past about owners putting up bonds for acquisitions of clubs, particularly when they promise to invest a certain amount or recover debts that football club might have. So put that money into a bond that, as you say, might generate interest. Now, Rich will probably know the legal ramifications of that much better than I do, because there must be a reason why it hasn't been put in place. So I think it's quite a sensible idea. And then either the benefiting club could benefit from the interest, or as you say, it could be distributed through the system in a different way.
Yeah, just picking up on that, I'd say it's the fit and proper persons test, which you'll often see talked about in the press, really fundamentally is that it's a question of the character of the person coming in. So it looks at criminal records, it looks at disqualifications. What it doesn't do fundamentally is look at a business plan and go through it and form some form of assessment of it, or having reviewed that business plan, right, say, okay, we need you to pay in X and as security in some way, shape or form that we will hold. And then you get into questions around, well, what actually happens to that money? How does it get deployed, et cetera, et cetera. And I think if I'm a regulator, I would be very reluctant to get into assessment of business plans in any meaningful sense, just in case, as it were, if I approve a business plan and it doesn't work, is it suddenly my fault? So it's yes, there's often complaints about it, and there's issues certainly when you look at the likes of Bury and things that Oldham have been through. I don't have an idea in my head that's like, actually, we need to definitely move to this system here. Again, in the US, it's far more regulated. The whole competition is far more regulated, and obviously no promotion or relegation at the top level. And they do look at it in a little more detail. And there are franchise fees as well, potentially payable. So it's a very different system. Obviously, it was largely built ground up like that over there, whereas here the system has evolved over a century. So very hard to retrofit that kind of thing to what we've got here.
Okay, great answers, both. So one final question that's come from Jane, and she's asking the big question is, in your opinion, what do you think the outcome of CAS is going to be? And I'm going to ask the three of you. I don't want this wishy-washy stuff. Jane wants an answer.
Can we ask Tony first?
We can come to Tony in the end, then.
He'll smack them out of the court, and then they'll go on and win the league when we get started again, by
the way. My view is that they will be fair. It will be upheld. UEFA will win the case. The evidence that City will reduce the penalty a little bit, and we will be talking about at least a 12-month ban, probably with a year suspended as well. That's my bet.
Okay.
Sorry, Tony.
That's all right. It's a good opinion. It's very logical that UEFA can't be seen to lose this.
I did think we were bringing an expert on, Rob, but maybe I've got it wrong.
I think, Rob, that's certainly when I talk to people, that's a consensus. But I'd say that's a consensus based, we haven't seen the evidence, right? We haven't seen the evidence. We haven't seen the arguments. So what are we basing it on? It's really interesting, knowledge of the organisations involved. I wouldn't rule out an annulment. I wouldn't rule out UEFA getting kicked out here. I think the allegations, certainly that we've seen in the CAS decision in 2019, was very much UEFA's investigation was rushed by the investigatory chamber, because I should add, the investigatory chamber is separate to UEFA and should be independent. But effectively saying it was rushed, it wasn't properly concluded. They're pretty serious allegations in there, and the underlying, I guess, allegation from City being that if you'd done this properly, you would be actually not charging us with anything in this situation. So I wouldn't rule out an annulment. I think it'll cause headlines because it depends what comes out, right? So if you're looking at it very objectively, there are these emails out there, and there hasn't been other than City saying they're out of context, there hasn't been a full breakdown of why. So it'll be interesting. I imagine if I'm City, then there'll be an interesting decision to be made whether you want the ultimate award or decision to be published as well, because there will be a lot of detail in there, and from PR reasons, that's going to be an interesting thing to go through too.
It'd be interesting. I think there'll be a lot of people sat on the boards of football clubs, European, worldwide clubs at the moment, worrying about the outcome of this, because I think the impact is far bigger. But it'd be interesting to come back to Ian, just to not sitting on the fence, and I know where your loyalties lie, my friend, but it'd be interesting to catch what you think.
Well, as a Liverpool fan, I'd like to see CAS throw the book at Man City.
That's your opinion, that's what you want, but in reality...
Massive implication, because I think even if they'll get knocked out in one of the earlier rounds anyway. But I think if Rich is able to park his Man United bias to one side, I'm more inclined to go with our Legal Eagles perspective on it and think there's a good chance they're going to get acquitted.
Okay. Hopefully that kind of puts an answer to it. So we got it's a 3-1. Sorry, Rob, you're on your own.
That's all right.
I do think there's a level of balanced thinking in where you were coming from. I know Rich and Ian have pulled aside their emotions to think about this in a logical sense. But I seriously, the impact of this on a global level now is there's so many stuff that if they can go back to before when FFP was in play, and the ramifications come back from there. Sorry, if I was Liverpool, I'd be shaking. I'm Man United.
Rich made a really important point, that the fact that some of this will come out in the press and won't come out in the press is really important. We saw it recently with the Saracens case in rugby union.
Absolutely.
We also saw it with QPR when they were sanctioned. So there'll be a way of dressing this up to try and make sure that both parties look okay, one way or the other. Look at the QPR situation. In the press, it comes out that they've got a £50 million fine, so it looks a really heavy sanction. Reality was that about 30 million of that was suspended. 15 million was allowed. They were allowed to convert debt into equity, and they ended up with about 5 or 6 million quid as an actual fine. The conversion of debt to equity wasn't permissible under FFP at the time, so they kind of dress it up to make it look like actually we're being really tough here on FFP and sanction the club, but the club actually are okay. Which is where I'm coming from with my year. I think that holds a bit of face for UEFA. I think City can probably cope with it because they know they've been a little bit naughty, and we'll see where it goes. But I'll be outvoted 3-1. I'm all good with that.
I think you're right there, Rob. What I'd say is it's almost the Dominic Cummings scenario as well, where someone looks like they've done something wrong, but they're off on a technicality, and then everyone else looks at it and goes, well, hey, if they can do that, then we can do it too. You're right. What actually comes out of this in terms of the messaging will be really interesting.
Yeah. I actually want to go with your prediction there, Rich, because I think that would be the best outcome for us, particularly as City fans. So I'm with you, buddy. Tony, I'm going to hand over to you just for some final words of wisdom.
think it will be interesting over the next couple of weeks, depending on what the outcome of this is potentially do a follow-up call. So we can discuss in more detail, the pros and cons of the outcome and where that leaves football moving forward. But we'll pick that up later, guys. Really appreciate your time as always. Informative, interesting. Loads of questions still coming in at the bottom, but unfortunately we've run out of time. So appreciate you all getting involved. Ian, fantastic for hosting as normal, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you.
Thanks very much. See you later.